ranking the best dads in anime from worst to best. And I selected 26 dads that I like know about. And not like, some of the ones, if you know of any anime dads, you let me know in the comment section, and next time I make the video, which will be like in a couple years, I'll include them. But I have 26 selected for this video, and it's the top 26, a ranking of the best dads, right? And we're starting from worst to best. So the worst one is Shou Tucker, but everybody probably knew about Shou Tucker if you're an anime head and you're watching this, right? You know that Shou Tucker, what he did to his daughter was uncalled for. Dads don't do that. You don't turn your daughter into some animal, and then, you're doing that to keep your state license when you should just take that L and, I don't know, get your, shit together some other way, and just, live like that. At least your daughter is still, she's still who she is and everything else. If he did it that way, but he didn't do that. He turned his daughter into a chimera, and then she ended up dying. We don't like it over here on this channel. At 25, I have Ozai. Ozai had 2 kids that he, manipulated their lives, for his purposes, for his ends. He is the Fire Lord. He, scarred Zuko after he spoke out. He could have handled that situation differently. He didn't have to do all that. His son is supposed to be the Fire Lord after him. He shouldn't want his son to, he should want to teach his son something, but he didn't have to do that, and then also have him as an outcast, and, he has to earn it back, his honor back, and it's all for his grand design. That's my problem with Ozai. It's all for him. It ain't for the betterment of his son. It's for, you're doing this for me because I'm the Fire Lord. And then his daughter is also, but she's actually gung-ho about it. Then he puts her, he kind of, confines her towards the end of Avatar. That's what I see. And she didn't like that because he made her the monster she is. She went out and she hunted down Avatar Aang. She, sees Ba Sing Se. She, played games with that Dali agents, convinced them to, and she like enjoyed the thrill of all that, and then she was told to sit back and do nothing. I don't think he's a good father. He's at 25. 24 on this list, because we're going from worst to best, right? The Demon King from 7 Deadly Sins, he's at 24. He tried to take over both of his sons' bodies. Now, they were part of his, and they're still demons, right? But they're, older, they have their own lives, they have their own females that like them, and they, they have relationships with other people. He's trying to take over their bodies so he can manifest into the real world because he can't do it any other way. He's kind of confined to his lands of the demon world, but he wanted to take over like human world and, fuck shit up there. So he was going to use his son's bodies to do that. He tried to take over Meliodas' body, and then he tried to take over his eldest body and failed. We don't like him here. He's at 24. At 23, Endeavour. Endeavour had 2 sons. He had 4 kids, right? He had, Natsuo, the other girl, and they didn't have any quirks, I believe, right? But Toya had a quirk, and he was the oldest brother. He was excited to do what his father told him and everything else, but his father, Endeavour, being impatient and not, quite, the good teacher, he, pushed him too hard, and then he ended up burning to death. And then he also wrote his son off as dead. He didn't, he didn't do his, research, or, he didn't seek his son. He was just he kind of wrote him off as dead. And then had another son named Shoto. Shoto was the one that he, was like, oh shit, my new son has ice powers and hot powers. He can cool himself down. Toya was kind of, weak, but he, it's kind of seems that way and shit, And then he has to fight his son and everything else because that comes back to bite him in the ass, right? And then his youngest son, who, he was trying to, groom to also be the best, has to then fight against his brother, and as a fucking parent, you don't want your kids fighting with each other, you know, because they're all from you. You know, ultimately, you know, he's not a good father. But he does try to, you know, repair things better with Shou. Because he knew that shit with Dabi was, like, basically not repairable, you know. But 22, I have Ging Freaks. Ging Freaks is at number 22. Ging Freaks did bring his son back, you know, after he knocked up some woman. We don't know who the fuck she is. He gave him to Mito. Now, you know how I said before, or maybe you don't, but I said that, you know, the children need their mothers and, like, you know, that type of care early on in their, like, development. And then later on, like, towards, like, you know, when they start to get up walking and talking to people and shit, they need their fathers, you know, especially Gon Freaks, right? But he wasn't there. But he was there in, like, you know, not physically there, but he left hints about where he was and other things. But my thing that gets him down lower, because, like, I would have Ging a little higher on this list, you know, actually, but the way he, you know, was like, no, you know, you go see my son. You know, if you're talking about my son, you go see him. You know, I don't need to go see him. You know, he was just kind of going off as, you know, a regular whatever type of person. Like, that's kind of like he didn't care about Gon, you know what I'm saying? You know, it sounded that way. So I have to, like, give him, like, some negative points for that. But he's better than everybody below him, you know? So he's at 22. At 21, I got Toji Zenin. Toji Zenin, you know, he held Megumi in his arms at one point in time. And you know, he had, you know, a thing with, you know, a woman, right? And then he just, you know, crashed out, I guess. And he, you know, kind of left his son, you know, in the hands of other people. But when it came down to the end of it, and, like, you know, the end of his life, when the lights were about to go out, he was like, he told Gojo to take care of him. Because he knew Gojo was powerful and strong, and he didn't want Megumi to end up in the hands of the Zenin clan, who's a bunch of, you know, punk-ass bitches, right? But, again, you don't want to leave your son in the hands of somebody else, you know, anyways. As a father, you don't want to do that shit. So, you know, because you just don't want that. So, at 21, I have Toji for that reason. You don't want to do that. You don't, you know, and he kind of got in, you know, his life and all that, you know, with his clan and all that. But he, you know, told Gojo to take care of, you know, Megumi, which ultimately I guess was the better decision. But, you know, you know, still you're pawning him off on somebody else. You know, that's not a good thing. So at 20, I got Hoenheim. Hoenheim could have stayed. And, like, because, like, basically what I know and understand, when he fucked with Trisha and, you know, impregnated her twice, he also gave her some of, like, he gave her that disease that she had. You know, he knew that he was the cause of her death. You know, he would ultimately be the cause of her death. So he left because he didn't want to bear all that pain. You know, but in doing that, his sons had to then bear that pain. They had to bury their mother. They wanted to, you know, revive her, and they went through all that traumatic shit because of him. And then he tried to reconcile later, but, you know, they were already, you know, doing what they had to do. You know, I don't know. Hohenheim's at 20 for me. You know, he's not the best father, but he's better than the people below him. At 19, I got Mr. Heartfilia. This is Lucy's father from Fairy Tail. Now, he was a guy that was about his business, but he loved money. He's a guy that loved money and shit. But, like, he loved it shit so much that he kind of, like, brushed his daughter to the wayside. He wasn't trying to get to know her as a girl, you know. Who is my daughter? Who is Lucy? Who's my little Lucy? You know, I'm giving her gifts, but not, you know, trying to figure out what the fuck she does. You know, taking a little bit of time out of my day to figure out what the fuck my daughter does, you know. And, like, he was just, like, a business guy, and he loved his money. But then he came on hard times, and then he came to Lucy for money because he's like, hey, you're my daughter. You like money just like me. You must have some, you know, funds. You know, you can help me out. You know, and, you know, that's not a good look, you know. And then Lucy even let him know, you know, you tried to, you know, and then he tried to, like, bring her back into the fold, too, before that. Phantom Lord tried to bring Lucy back to her father, and he was gonna keep her as you wear dresses and you be a proper daughter, and you'll marry somebody that I arranged for you because we're the Heartfilia family and we're noble and aristocratic and all that, sophisticated and all that extra shit, right? And she's like, no, I'd rather be a fairy tale member. You never took the time to get to know me. But in his last days, he did after she lit him up and shit for asking for money and shit. Every year after she was sealed away on Tenro Island for 7 years, she had 7 presents when she came back home. It's from her dad, and he was like, I could at least do this for you. I wasn't the best father, but that was the only good thing he did. So he's at 19. Because that whole time growing up, he wasn't doing anything. But when, later on, he started to, do some things. But number 18, I got Senjuro. Senjuro is the father of, Kodra, right? And he, basically he became a drunk. He didn't become a drunk after, Rengoku died. Kodra Rengoku died. That ain't when he started drinking. He started drinking more because he actually became a drunk before that, if you actually pay attention and shit, because his wife passed away. And Rengoku understood that his father was upset, but Rengoku was like, I want to cheer my father up. Maybe if I become a demon slayer, and also he's just a guy that's similar to his father, and his father was a demon slayer, and he's like, yeah, father, I'm going to become a demon slayer. And his father's like, okay, do your thing. I'll be here, whatever. He ended up dying, and then he started drinking more, which is not a good thing. His other son was concerned and shit for his health and didn't you even turned to drink it more after, my brother died, and, he slapped his son, and, Tandra had to let him know, what you're saying about your son ain't true. Your son wasn't weak. He was a brave fucking, guy who stood on business. I've seen it with my own eyes. So Senjuro's at 18, he could have put the bottle down, but we move on to 17. 17, we have, oh my God, where's 17 at on my list? Oh, Garp, Monkey D. Garp. Garp was the father of Dragon, but Dragon, he raised Dragon up to be a Marine, and he was a Marine. We know that Dragon was a Marine now, confirmed in the manga and shit, right? But he stood for things that a young man like Dragon couldn't stand for. And once he found out that his father, basically glanced over some shit, he's like, how could you? I can't stand for this shit. I'm gone. He kind of what I'm saying is Garp was right for what he did, but he was also wrong for what he did. Being a Marine's a good thing. You want to protect people. You want to protect the common folks and shit. That's cool. But then you want to glance over the fact that he cost the world government, and the world government has, the shit on God Valley where they're, hunting down these rabbits, which are people who are slaves, and, killing them for points and everything else. And the winner gets a trophy, and the trophy could be shot, and all this other shit, and then, they're poisoning people and, destroying islands and all this shit. And he's basically saying by being connected to the Marines and they're connected to the world government, he just can't do that. Dragon can't do that. But Garp is saying, no, son, you're the one that's wrong. He's telling his son that he's wrong. I don't know. He couldn't see shit Dragon's way. A little bit at least. And he kind of did a little bit. But he's still not doing anything to change the system, the way things ran, because he is a guy who has that kind of ability, and he's friends with Sengoku the Buddha, and they could come together and be like, you know what, the government's doing too much and we want to protect the people, we want to break off, that type of thing. But they never do that. And that's because Garp, in action on that kind of ends, and like glancing over that shit where Dragon don't, and that's why I actually have Dragon above Garp as far as being a better father goes. Now, Dragon as a father was not there. I understand he wasn't there, but he had a lot on his plate. He's the revolutionary leader. If you're the revolutionary leader and you're starting just you have to convince other people that you're right. You have to fucking, keep these people with you. You have to put these people in certain places. We have to have a strategic plan to overthrow these people. This is not a fucking, easy task to, come up with, you know, and like try to, dethrone Emu and all of them, right? He don't even know about that shit. Like, he's still even trying to like calculate shit out now. Guys, this guy has a job to do. So like, he didn't want to bring that shit on Luffy. He's the world's most wanted man because he's the revolutionary dragon. He heads that, front. He's the face of the revolutionary army. So Luffy would have been hunted down and killed, knowing that he's the son of dragon. Just because, the connection, and then he could end up like his father, that type of thing. Luffy ended up taking the path of a pirate instead. Now, Dragon doesn't side with pirates. That's not what his aim is. And he doesn't side with the Marines either. He's trying to change the world. He's a revolutionary, y'all. He don't hate his son, though. He don't hate Luffy because he don't, and he don't hate Luffy because he saved Luffy's life. And that's the thing that a father does. A father takes initiative and saves their son's life when they're in danger and shit. And they do that. My boy needs me. I'm going to help him out. And he did that, for him in Logtown. And that was kind of a key moment and shit. There was some key players there, Buggy, who became an emperor, and then Smoker, who later became a vice admiral. And Luffy, was, and, he, because of his father, he was able to continue his journey and shit, And that's key for Luffy, that, if Luffy thinks like that, and Dragon gets in trouble one day, I don't know, maybe he does go to save the Dragon, out of like, you helped me out once, I'm going to help you out. Because Luffy is a kind of guy that's like that, But, I think, he does care about Luffy, a little more than Dragon cares about him. So I have him above Dragon, or Dragon above Garp. But at 15, we have, we have 15. Toga, that's the father of Inuyasha and Sesshomaru. He left one sword for Sesshomaru and one for Inuyasha. The one that's more offensive powers and offensive capabilities gave to Inuyasha. The one that can heal people, he gave to Sesshomaru. Sesshomaru's a demon on his own who has that kind of strength. He can hold down for himself. He can hold down for other people if he needs to. His father's lands are basically his. He took over for Toga when he passed away, as the like most powerful demon in the land, and it's true. He don't need all that extra power. His brother Inuyasha needs that shit because he's a half demon. People look at him sideways and other things. He needs that to defend himself, from like the humans and the fucking demons, because people get jealous and all kind of shit, And Sesshomaru had to learn, how to, not be so, power hungry, I guess, and like kind of like also, and Sesshomaru respected his father too, like greatly. He was like, why would you do that to me? It was a slap in the face to Sesshomaru. Why would you, I'm walking exactly like you walked, but you're still gonna slap me in the face and give it to him over me. And really it was, Sesshomaru did have all those qualities, but he was lacking one thing. He didn't know how to like, calm the fuck down, and it's not about that. You have people that you care about, you're gonna protect them. And the healing sword is like that. You have to be also a kind person too when you're like powerful, because you have to protect the people below you. The people who look to you for your strength and power, right? And then he had to learn that shit, right? And then Inuyasha had to learn to, I don't know, be strong and, handle that fucking blade, because, Inuyasha was having problems holding it and shit, even though it's made for him. And then they had to come together to defeat Naraku and some other demons during the show. and that was Toga's plan, but he was like not present because he had died and shit, so like he couldn't do that for Inuyasha. Inuyasha knew nothing of Toga, and then his other son knew all kind of shit about their father, and that also played into their like, rivalries. Like, you have no idea who the fuck our father is and shit. You have no idea, and all kind of shit, and Inuyasha's like, I don't care, I have to do this, and if he left this for me, then, cool, I'm going to use it. And then they had to put their differences aside and everything else. So it worked in the end, but, it kind of, caused conflicts with his sons and shit. Like, maybe he knew that, maybe he didn't, but it did. So, I have to put him at 15. And then at 14, I got Minato. Minato is low because he wasn't there for Naruto physically growing up. I know what he did for Naruto was great. He gave him the power of the nine-tailed fox, but that came with, downsides. He was shunned from the village. People looked down on him. He's that demon child. That brat who, lives in that house over there, who's annoying and writes on the faces and shit. He's, that boy, that nobody cares about. But then he became somebody that they did, start eating calls to. But that took time and everything on Naruto's part, and Minato's thinking is like, okay, I have to protect the village and I have to protect my son. So I'm going to seal half of the demon inside my son, Kurama inside my son and half inside of me. And then when Naruto came against Pain later on to save the village, Minato showed up to, save Naruto from opening the gate and letting Kurama out fully, because he knew about the power and shit, We know that the Hokage had notes in their desk and shit about Kurama. Over here we know that. But he knew that Naruto could, handle the power and everything else. But it still led to Naruto, going through some things. And he kind of like don't get that a little bit. It's for him, it's like, yeah, I did that because you were my son. But it was like a long time coming. It didn't happen overnight where people, started, acknowledging Naruto for, what he did and everything else. He had to work for it and everything else. He had to earn it. But, and he wasn't there growing up. And, I have to, like, give credence to that. It's a father. You have to be there for a kid, too. Not a bad man. I ain't saying that. He's 14 out of 26. 13, I got Gildarts. Gildarts didn't know about Kana's existence. She was, a little girl that said hi to him every time he came back from mission. And he was like, yeah, hey, you're that little girl who's always kind in other things. I'm going to be back, hopefully when you come back, you're grown in other things and you're, still happy in other things. And she was, but at the same time, she wasn't, because she knew that Gildarts was her father, but she didn't have the courage to go up to him and tell him, hey, I'm your daughter. He had no idea. Tenro Island comes around, and then she tells him, she's like basically a woman at that point. And he's like, I had no idea. And she's kind of upset a little bit. But he's like, I had no idea. Girl, I would have been, I would have took less missions. I would have been there for your birthdays and all kind of shit, if you had let me know. And for him, I'm just like, it was kind of a shitty situation. But he was in there for Kana and shit. He saved her from Blue Note Stinger, and he also saved her from, August. They fought against August together, and their relationship, kind of got better. But I got him at 13. He can't help that he didn't know his daughter. But at 12, I got Sasuke Uchiha. Sasuke is a father that was there a little bit, but he understood that he had to protect Sarada. He had to go out and seek, where the enemy. He's trying to strike the enemy first, and he knew that Sarada had to stay in the village and not get caught up in shit too much, because he's also one who has to bring his people back. So, like, he cares about his daughter more than you think as the viewer. Because I know some people in the Naruto community hate Sasuke and want his bloodline to end. But I'm like, that shit's cool. He wants to bring his people back. And that's his, baby girl and shit. He's going to, not be there all the time, but he's going to be there. And then he, like, kind of let Naruto, take over, like, the, training her because she wants to become the Hokage. And he's like, okay, well, I'm not the Hokage. He's the Hokage. That's what he does. He's the one that who knows about that job. I don't know about it. And he's like, she don't hate, Sasuke. She wishes that he was there a little more and other things, but she also understands that Sasuke has a job to do to protect her. And she understands that they're the only two left. So at 11, I got Akota from Avatar. Akota, after, Katara's mother died, he went to war. He's like, we're going to stop these people from coming to our place. We're going to let them know that the water tribe should not be fucked with. They did raids. They killed your mother. I'm going to go, stop them so they don't kill you. And Sokka understood that. Katara was the one that didn't understand. Like, she did, but she didn't. Because she was like, I know, but, you still weren't there. And, because of that, I have to give him, like, points off, y'all. But, I understand that Akota had to do that, too. Sokka understood that he had to do that. And he told Sokka, he was like, I'll train you up to, a certain level, and you have to protect the village from any, like, one ship that might show up here. Because at that point, they weren't sending raids anymore. After Katara's mom died, they weren't sending any firebending raids no more. Because she was the last southern waterbender. And, like, they didn't have to worry about that shit no more. So, they left. Akota didn't know that Zuko and all them would pull up and other things. And then eventually Aang found them, and they met again. And, it was just Katara who was kind of, salty and shit. But, she understood, ultimately that he had to do that to protect them, from a distance. But for her, she needed him there, And he knew that, he didn't want to do that to her. But he had to. Ultimately she would be alive if he went to stop that shit from happening. It's one of those situations. He's not a bad father, though. 10, I got Ryuken. Ryuken's the father of Uryu Ishida from Bleach. Ryuken was, there. He was there for Uryu. Now he was stern and strict and other things, go to school and other things. Don't talk to me about, your grandfather. You don't really know about Quincy shit. He had to teach Uryu how to get his Quincy powers back once he, like, burnt them out. And then he had to, and then also, and see, like, in the fourth core, he does some things, too. He was there for Uryu and shit, but he wasn't, like, the best father, in the world. But your father ain't supposed to be your best friend, It's supposed to be stern and supposed to be, strong and, letting you know when you fucked up, and that you gotta, shape up and, do better, as a man, you can't be, lacking in any kind of way. Or maybe you're, like, looking for information that you shouldn't be looking for, that type of deal, and you just can't do that, And that's that, Ryuken's, like, not a guy that people bring up, but I'm bringing him up because he's big 3 father, and I'm like, he ain't that bad compared to, like, the people below him. He's actually good because he's there for Uryu. Uryu had food to eat. Uryu had, books to read and all kinds of shit, man. They just weren't buddy-buddy, and they ain't supposed to be, but they understood each other. It ain't like Uryu wanted his father to die. He understood his father was a Quincy and shit, too. They just didn't, see eye to eye on certain shit. But at 9, I have Vegeta. Vegeta was a Saiyan, or is a Saiyan, not was. Always will be the Prince of all Saiyans. King to some people, but he put in his son, like, what it meant to be a Saiyan, because Trunks didn't really know. He knew he was half Saiyan, but he didn't know what it actually meant until he went back in time and he saw his father train in the hyperbolic time chamber. He was, like, on a different level. Like, Trunks had trained before with Gohan, but it wasn't the same. Vegeta's intense, like, will and desire and pride in, being a Saiyan to push past Goku and, achieve, heights of being, like, the most powerful in the universe was, like, some shit Trunks never seen, and he took pride in that himself, and he actually ended up becoming more powerful than Vegeta because he saw his father and everything else, inspired his son to do, better. He sent his son off, on good terms and shit. Even, like, when Cell killed him, he got pissed, Vegeta did, and he went in and took action. And now he was a little bit, rough with him a little bit, his other son, his other Trunks, um, he punched him in the face, but he was like, hey, I didn't tell you that I wasn't going to punch you in the face, but I'm going to take you to the park, because you showed me some shit that, was impressive. I wasn't doing that shit at 8 years old. Gohan wasn't, Goku wasn't, you're going to go to the park. You show me something, you can get a reward. He's a little boy that's 8, and then he told his son, to watch, after Bulma and everything else because he was going to die. That was when he was fighting against Majin Buu, right? And then later on, he came back to the future to help his son, fight against, Goku Black and Zamasu, you know. Vegeta was there for Trunks, and they might not have the best relationship, but it's pretty good because they do like to train with each other. It ain't like Trunks is like being forced to train or anything, and even like because like it comes out anyways. Even if Trunks doesn't want to train with his dad, he's like, oh, why do I need to, And then he's like, you know what, fuck it, I want to go above you, And it's kind of like a cool, father son, thing. But I got him at number 9. He could have done things a little bit differently, I guess, but he's a Saiyan, and it's Dragon Ball Z, y'all. You gotta remember that, too. Number 8, I got Goku. Goku had a great relationship with the son. He died twice for Gohan. He died for Gohan when fighting against Raditz. He took a hole to the chest, and he was like, I'll be back. And then he came back, and he saved him from Vegeta. Now, Gohan had to save his father from Vegeta, if we're actually looking at things, right? But they had a good relationship. Gohan never looked down. He always admired Goku and everything. He was kind of questioning his father when he put him in the fucking Cell games. Like, I'm the one who's supposed to defeat Cell. Like, what the, kind of like, what the fuck are you thinking? I'm some boy and you're going to put it all on me. He's like, but you're my son. And then, Gohan's like, he's kind of not wrong because I've always had that, potential in me, even when I was younger and shit. And he, ended up finding it and, but then Cell ended up, pulling moves that they didn't know was going to happen. And Goku had to, die for Gohan and everybody. And then he came back later. And it's really, his relationship with Goten, I think, is what people have a problem with. But he was there for Goten. He was like, hey, you can, spend time with me a little bit, but I'm only here for a day. He can't help that. Baba's power don't work like that, y'all. This is not Shenron's power. He then got brought back to life and, he's doing shit with Goten in Dragon Ball Super. They're in the garden, doing shit together. Little things like that, like he did with Gohan when he was younger. And then training at the end of Dragon Ball Z. He's like, you want to go see that girl? You have to go into the tournament first and train it with me, but after that, you can go see your girl, and that's what a father would try to do, So Goku is at number 8. But at number 7, I have Isshin. Isshin Kurosaki. Isshin Kurosaki is at number 7 because he had to put on, he had to stay positive even after his, girl died. And he was like, you know what? She died, but you still have your father, and I'm here. It's cool. You don't have to go without, both your parents. I'm still here. And they had to, take that, it was, hard on their family, and he, kind of didn't show, that, weaker side of himself, where he was crying and other things too much. He wasn't trying to. He tried to, handle it, however he could. And they had food and, he, took care of people like, the clinic and everything else. He had both kids, all kids were in school. And, he, was a little bit rougher on Ichigo, but Ichigo's the older one. So he was like, I'm tougher on you. Your sisters, I'm going to be there for them. And that's when he got his soul reaper power back. Isshin got his soul reaper power back. See, he couldn't let Ichigo know that he knew about Ichigo and shit until he had his soul reaper power back. Because then he can be like, hey, son, it comes from somewhere. I have some too. And you have, that about you now too. You can, you're powerful and other things you're going to fight. I'm here for you, for this enemy called Aizen, because he understood how powerful Aizen was. And then he even gave Ichigo a way to, become even more powerful. You have to go into Dongai Precipice, I'll feed them my energy. And they had like a good, relationship. I ain't gonna say they don't. And then he had to stay back and protect Yuzu and Kari. He's not bad at all. I could even have him higher than 7. But I'm at 7. At number 6, I got Naruto. Uzumaki Naruto, he took his kids and he did a 180 from what he had. Boruto had all of it. Like, don't even fucking play games with me, Naruto. Man, you gotta piss me the fuck off. This boy is spoiled by Naruto. Naruto has him cool. He has a house, he has food, and he is there for Boruto. He has to be a clone and go there because of the Hokage work. In the times of Naruto, what he's living in now in Boruto, they have all kind of shit. This is not a world that Hashirama came up in or these other Hokages. He kind of has it harder. They're dealing with Otsutsuki and then still relationships with the other villages, and then the arrival of like new technology and all that extra stuff, and how that impacts the ninja world and this and all that extra stuff, and then Shikamaru will get on Naruto's ass if he's like actually not there and all this other thing. Boruto understands that he's just a spoiled brat, y'all. He's a spoiled fucking brat. Himawari is too, he cares for both of his kids really well. They all got, good schooling and everything. He's there to train with his son and everything. The only reason I give him that 6th position because they are a little spoiled, but Naruto, we understand why Naruto would do that because the way he lived, he would not want his kids to go through any of that. So, he didn't know that his son would be a little bit ungrateful at times, another thing. Or maybe he did because he's older now and, he's a dad now, but, Naruto ain't a bad father. He's at number 6. And then I got Death at number 5. Death is at number 5 because Death runs a school, and his son was like, I want to join. And he's like, well, I don't need you to join. You're already powerful as it is. You're already a Meister, essentially. But if you want to go to school and, be like the other kids, I ain't going to stop you. But he did have to stop his son from, like, digging in for information. See, he had a pass to do all kinds of, he's kind of spoiled a little bit, too. Kid is, but like Kid also, I don't know, not like Boruto. Kid's kind of like what I'm saying with Kid. Kid is a character that is very, particular about things. That's just how he is as a character. It's nothing his father put on him. There ain't nothing his father put on him. That's just how Kid is as a character. Kid, wanted to look into things about, what was going on, and he's like, you can't do that. Ebon, that's my business, son. I have to handle that because that is what I can handle. You don't need to look into that because that's not what you need to do. You need to be, going to class with Mr. Stein, Dr. Stein, and, doing that because that's what you're here for. That's what you wanted to do. And they kind of had a little, bitching contest with each other a little bit. But ultimately, Kid understood that, that shit wasn't for him, and his father is Death, the God that presides over the school and everything else, so it is his job to defend against the like big villains and shit, right? So he's at number 5, not the worst father in the world. But number 4 is Oden. Kozuki Oden was good. He had Hiyori and Momonosuke on the boat. Both of them came back to Wano. He danced in the street like a fool to save his family. He believed he was saving his family and his people. But eventually, Kaido and, Orochi took things into their own hands and they started, Udon prison and polluting the water and feeding smiles fruits to people, against their will and shit, or like starving them out first and then giving them the fruit, as like hey, I can do something good for you people, but it ain't, and then he, goes to fight against Kaido and then he gets defeated, And this happens when they're young, but they all, like, Momonosuke remembers his father. He don't hate his father. He don't have anything bad to say about his father. He understands, and Momonosuke understands he has some big shoes to step into too, because like his father was supposed to be the Shogun of Wano, and his father was a powerful samurai, and all that shit is like respect for his father, and he's like, how can I ever, stack up to who my father was, that type of thing for Momonosuke, that is what, a son looks like. That's not a bad relationship he has with Oden. Like, he don't have that type of, negative, he wishes his father was still alive so he could handle Kaido, that type of thing. Hiyori, she was like, I had to go through all this, but she understood that her father, you know, didn't want that shit for her. Her father was a good, happy, funny kind of guy. He protected her from, or tried to protect her from Kaido. You know, she, misses him too. When your kids miss you and shit, you're a good father. Just saying. Number 3, Silva Zoldyck. Silva Zoldyck, he has 5 kids. And he don't treat them differently. He brought them up for the business. They're assassins, so they're gonna be, assassins just like their dad, just like their grandfather before them. And they all like do that. Now he likes Killua because Killua, shows great potential. But Killua, unfortunately for him, Killua wants to be a hunter and not do that. But that's the thing about Silva. Silva wasn't upset. He was upset a little bit, and he's like, I have to like kind of give that off to maybe one of my other sons, but you take care of your friends and you treat them well and other things if you really want to do that hunter shit, and you do that, and then Killua was like, yeah, that's cool, I promise I'll be good to my friends and everything else, and then they went their separate ways on like good terms. I don't know, not a bad father in my eyes. He could have, done other things. He's an assassin. He could have, like, Maluki, keep, beating his ass and other things, and he, like, still allowed that to happen. But, like, and Killua understands why he allowed that to happen. We're assassins. And it's just how their family operates and shit. He wasn't gonna, be now. But Silva did, treat Alaka a little bit differently. But that's because he fears that kid. This kid can, kill anyone essentially in that world if they wanted to, But that's just the way it is over there. He's at number 3, but at number 2, I have May Hughes. May Hughes at number 2 from Full Metal Alchemist. May Hughes was a great father. He always thought about his wife and daughter, even when he was at war against the Ishvalans. He's like, I don't know why I'm out here doing this, but I think I'm out here doing this to protect them. And like that was his motivation. I need to get back to my family. I'm doing this for them, that type of thing. And then he came back and he was there with them. Like every time he had time off, he was with his family. Everybody knew May Hughes as a good father, like type, that's the guy that's daddy and shit at home. He cares for his life. He cares about his daughter, she was sad when she found out his daughter died, or her dad died, once it actually sinked in, because she was actually kind of young, but still, he wasn't a shitty father. He made sure, food was on the table and everything else, and, made sure she was happy. And, he still went to work and, did that, He's at number 2. I got Avatar Aang at number 1. I know. Avatar Aang. Avatar Aang is like, he had to bring his people back. He brought Tenzin into the world. Tenzin then brought some other airbenders into the world. Tenzin took to Aang because he had, Aang's, airbending skills. He had Bumi, who he named after his best friend, King Bumi. He had, the fucking waterbender girl, who kind of took more after Katara, but he still, none of his kids hated him, and they all understood that he was the Avatar, understood that he, even, they understood that they kind of had, different things about their father, he wasn't the best at this, but he was still a good father. You know, that type of thing. You know, they had good things to say and, you know, bad things, but, you know, the good things outweighed the bad thing. You know, that type of thing. You know, and that's why I got him at number one. You know, they weren't, you know, shitting on Aang. And also Aang's, you know, that's what he had to do. You know, that's what we wanted for Aang, you know, at the end of Avatar. You know, and then when we see that in Korra as fans, we're like, damn, that's cool. You know, he got to, you know, keep his people alive. But that is, you know, the ranking of the best dads in anime, as told by Darius the Great Angel. You know, I'll remake this video. You guys let me know if I missed any fathers and if they're good or bad, or if they should be lower on the list or higher on the list. Be cool, call in the corner.